share.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Blaine. We are now live on Facebook for those who want to share it on your personal pages. This is the Policing in Schools and Policing Youth Committee. Tonight, we will talk a bit about, just get updates on the work that has been happening, but the majority of the night is going to be spent learning from, growing with, agitating potentially ourselves and our guests around alternatives to policing, and really looking at approaches that are rooted in restorative and transformative justice. And so thank you to Impact Justice for coordinating this panel of speakers, and thank you to all of our speakers for taking the time out to join us today and share all of your wonders with us. Before we get into the panel discussion, I want to pass it to Impact Justice to see if there are any announcements or any work around potentially what we've been doing in the past couple of weeks that you all can share.
Thanks, Samantha. Yeah, so for those of you who weren't here last week, we basically spent the entire meeting, it was a closed meeting, so we would have a chance to discuss some of the additional draft recommendations we haven't gone over yet. We're able to get through about 9 more. We still have a number left. And so what I'm gonna do is after tonight's meeting, I will send out a Google Doc with the remaining draft recommendations, including any that we come up with tonight. We are running a little bit short on time at this point to finalize our committee's list of recommendations and to really kind of move into the report recommendation writing and researching phase of things. So we're asking that everyone review and provide any feedback or comments, ask any questions, make any requests for additional data or information on the remaining recommendations in the Google Doc that I will send out tonight after tonight's meeting by the end of the day on Sunday. And so I will pause there in case there are any questions, concerns. I know it's a short turnaround time. Cool, I'll keep going then. And reach out to us if anything comes up, if you do have any questions after tonight. So tonight, I am super excited about our panel. This is our alternatives panel, our second to last panel for this committee. So we will be featuring 3 brilliant speakers. So first we have Dr. Michelle Chatman. She's a professor in the Crime, Justice, and Security Studies program at the University of the District of Columbia. We have Bilphena Yahwon, who's a Baltimore-based writer and restorative practices specialist. And then Ashlee George, who's the co-director of the Restorative Justice Project at Impact Justice. So I will hand this over to Samantha, who will be facilitating tonight's panel.
Awesome, thank you so much, Sia. And while I'll be facilitating, I have a co-facilitator tonight, apparently. His name is Prince. I'm gonna try to keep him quiet as much as possible and or mute myself. Just to get us started, it would be great to hear from each of you all a little bit more about yourself. In particular, if you can describe kind of the values and the principles that really are at the foundation of the work that you do. And we can start with whomever wants to jump in.
I can start. Good evening, everybody. Excited to be here with all of you. Ashlee, go by she or hers. And as you said, I'm with Impact Justice, the co-director of the Restorative Justice Project. I started officially doing restorative justice about 13 years ago within the middle school system in Oakland Unified School District. I led one of the first school sites that have a fully restorative approach to discipline as their main go-to. And so it's built into the culture. There are other elements such as PBIS as well, but I led the efforts in Oakland. And philosophies behind my approach to restorative justice. And I said officially because I feel like I've been practicing what we call restorative justice in youth development spaces. So like creating, like I let young people, we sat in circle, everyone had the opportunity, we did consensus. So there are elements of that as an approach to leadership and really including folks. And so when I think about restorative justice, I always say this, I come back to it's really, really, really about relationships. How do you nurture those, or how do you build relationships? How do you nurture those relationships? And then when a harm has occurred, how do you mend those? And I feel like oftentimes, I'll speak for myself, I love building the relationships. That nurturing and sustaining piece is like, you know, it takes work. You have to put in energy. It's like tending to a garden. And so working at the school sites, supporting young people, their families, teachers, administration to like really not just start and initiate their relationships, but continue to build upon those relationships. Other values that I really, really hold dear, not just in restorative justice, but my approach to work and just being in general is a power with approach instead of a power over. And so the paradigm and like when you shift from a power over to a power with, the potential of creativity, innovation, collaboration, people feel like they belong. It emerges. And so there's a lot more, for me, potential when approaching it like that. And we working at a middle school, I don't know if you remember what it's like being in a middle school, but it's like everything in all the places all at once. And oftentimes young people felt like they didn't have a place where they were seen. They didn't feel like they had a place where they were heard. And they didn't feel like people really understood what they were going through, whether that's what they're going through with their friends, with their families, with their community. And so creating spaces for people to be in community with one another during using the circle process, and not just the young people. I started with the young people, but and I can tell me how much time I have, but just a little bit background. So the school I worked at, one of the schools I worked at, where we implemented this approach or this model, there was tons of transition with administration. So every year for the last 4 years, they had new vice principal and a new principal. And so you can only imagine like what that does to the stability, consistency. And then the teachers are like, you know, we're having all this transition. You all are bringing new programs. We're doing this, we're doing that. And so when restorative justice was introduced, folks were like, I don't know, I'm not really sure about that. But working with young people and supporting when a harm has occurred, doing circles and building a peacemaker program. So like young people actually kept circle for their peers. And then eventually working my way into working with the adults. And I feel like it's really, really important when you're thinking about doing restorative justice in schools. It's not something that's done to the young people. It's not something that's just done for the young people. As adults, we need to learn how to have good relationships with one another. We need to learn how to be honest and have open communication and talk about the things that may be uncomfortable. And we need to lean into accountability. And so we're asking that of our young people. It's important that as adults, we practice that as well. And so I found that oftentimes that most of the pushback that I would get around like building the community was originally like the adults had to work out their stuff, right? And there's a reason for it, right? There's a lot of transition. There was a lot of work. And so creating spaces for adults, for teachers to be able to kind of share their experience as being teachers and create spaces for them to be heard, to be listened to be valued. And so really, at the end of it, not just with the young people and the teachers and the administration, but also parents, people want to be heard, people want to be seen, and people want to be respected. And when you do all of those things, they feel like their dignity is intact. And so at the end of the day, we are moving, creating processes where all people, not just adults, but young people as well, like where their dignity is intact. That's how we move towards a liberated society. So it's like a brief kind of approach that I have and that I bring. And the last piece I just want to name, so I mentioned PBIS, so it's important to have other systems of discipline that are very specific, that looks at data, that looks at like where events are happening and like targets those events. And there needs to be a racial equity lens. Just because you do restorative justice, I'm sure y'all are familiar, doesn't mean that it addresses racism within the school. And so there also has to be that look as well. So I'll stop it there and then see what other questions folks have.
Thanks, Ashlee.
Hi, you all.
Dr. Scott. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Bilphena. And so in terms of principle is how I approach this work. I always like to begin by saying why my work prioritizes and honors all children and youth, that my priority, though, is Black children, Black women and children specifically. That is where I work from. That is my priority, and that will always be my priority. And on top of that, I move from an abolitionist lens, which means that I'm working towards a world without prisons and a world without police, right? Which is why I am invested in transformative justice work, because I understand that so many of the systems and structures that exist, specifically exist to keep Black folks still oppressed, right? And in order for us to see true liberation for Black folks, for Black children, a world with police and prisons cannot exist. And so that is my end all be all. I'm not trying to create alternatives. I'm not trying to create remixes, because what we do know is that we have already created alternatives to police. The current system that we're looking at is an alternative. And we have to be honest about the ways in which that policing in all forms, including school police and prisons, are directly linked to slavery, and that Black people will never ever see liberation as long as we have cages and as long as we have people putting us in cages. And so it's always important for me to begin by creating that basis, that everything I share and all of the answers that I give tonight will come from an abolitionist lens. But in addition to that, I have multiple identities, right? So I am a former refugee. I came to this country in 2001 from Ivory Coast. I was born in Liberia, but my family migrated to Ivory Coast. And so having that and being an immigrant to this country is that it has allowed me to see the ways in which systems and structures exist on an international level. And so when we think about policing and we think about prisons and we think about Black children, we know that we must have a global lens because white supremacy is global. And so I come to this work also carrying that identity as an immigrant to this community, right? And so I think also another part of my work, right, is a valuing of Black children's voice. Is not simply about saying that we care and we love our children, but that we must value Black children as knowledge producers and as thinkers, and as children who already have a lot of the answers that we're looking for. And so they do know what culture should look like. They do know what the school systems should look like. They do know what their classroom spaces should look like. And I think rather than constantly adults telling Black children what it is that they need, that we simply should ask them because they know. And then lastly, my work is concerned with also Black girls. We understand that Black girls, specifically their interaction with the school system, is very different from other children, right? In that they resemble misogynoir. So Black girls at the age of 5 are already experiencing what it means to be a Black woman, because Black girls are adultified and criminalized within the school system, and the presence of police only exacerbates that. And so there are multiple ways that I come to this work, but I think I always want to place an emphasis on that. I'm concerned with Black children. I'm concerned with Black women. I'm concerned with the absence, right, of prisons and police, and to see a world, right, where we don't rely on shackles and where we don't rely on cages and where we don't rely on genocide and the dehumanization of an entire people to continue building. And so those are the principles that I am coming to this conversation with.
Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you so much for having me. This is wonderful. Good evening, Professor Hampton, and good to see your face. I come from an anti-oppressive, justice-oriented, and healing perspective. I really cannot articulate any more clearly than these two women have what drives my work: love for Black people, love for Black children, freedom for Black people, liberation for Black people. I think what I in that realm though, I think I like to center healing a lot too, because I understand that living in a society, living in a world that centers whiteness and white comfort and white domination, we have been wounded and damaged by that construct. And so as important as it is to dismantle those systems and ideologies and behaviors and beliefs. I'm an anthropologist, so all of this stuff works together, right? It's a whole systemic structural lens rooted in history. It's also important that we center our healing and restoration. So a good portion of my work centers around mindfulness, contemplative approaches, decolonial approaches that remind us of our inherent value and worth and our cultural ways of being that affirm us. So that is what I bring. So I think it's very much aligned with what Ashlee and Bilphena offer, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you so much to all of you all. And again, welcome to this space. Want to ask each of you all, and I'm going to pull out specific aspects that I think were unique in what you all said, but feel free to expound beyond that. So as of now, one of the recommendations we've been looking at in terms of policing in schools is removing police from schools. So divesting from police altogether from our schools and investing in the resources and the supports that create a safe, healthier, more equitable, more liberatory learning environment. And so really curious, actually for you, wanted to know in terms of recommendations, like what does that look like for the investment piece when you talk a lot about building relationships and strengthening relationships with all stakeholders. And so curious if you can name some like really tangible pieces that we can invest in to make those relationships possible. Bilphena, and I'll share with all you, Bilphena, same perspective when you're looking from an abolitionist lens, and greatly appreciate you bringing that lens to this conversation. What does that look like? What are the investments we need to make abolition, and in this very macro way, removing police from schools possible? What are the investments there? And then Dr. Chatman, when you talk about healing in particular, like what are we investing in and what could some of those recommendations be to make that possible in our schools?
So within the schools, schools have been punitive and they are set up with a punitive paradigm. And oftentimes restorative justice, they try to cram it in, and we're gonna do, I often call it the circle and the square. And so one thing has to be where the leadership, administration, the district, everyone, you have to make a decision to move from a punitive approach, and that's with one another, that's with learning, to a restorative one. So not suspending young people. So when I worked at the school, young people were cutting, and what did they do to young people who cut? They suspended them for a day or gave them in-house suspension, right? Like in that mind frame, like if you actually sit down and think like, why did we do this? What are we trying to get to, right? And so like that type of evaluation and thought processes need to start kind of, you have to weed out the toxic, we talk about healing, like weed out that punitive, harmful toxicity that's in the school system. And so that has to be very intentional by the leadership. The leadership has to support restorative justice, not just as a program, but really as a philosophy, as a practice. There needs to be other systems that are put in place. So I mentioned like looking at discipline and data. So oftentimes young kids, Black kids, are being sent out of the classroom. Who are the teachers who are constantly sending out certain children? What times of day is it happening? Why is it happening at that time of day? And creating a group of people who are identifying and looking into that information to investigate, not to punish, but to then ask, what do you need? And that question never gets asked to young people. What's going on and what do you need? And so if we can pause, move things a little bit slower and take the time up front, oftentimes like with teachers, another thing that you can tangibly do is like really, when you talk about culture, like building community, we had teachers, and I'm like, I'm gonna come in and do a community circle so like your class can get to know each other. Some teachers are down for it. Other teachers like, nah, I don't wanna do it. I was like, I know it seems like it's going to take away from the benchmarks. I know it seems like it's going to take away from your lesson plan. I know it seems like it's going to take away from the learning. But if you don't invest the time now, I guarantee you're going to have to invest the time later, right? Because there's going to be ways where, like in the classroom, where the culture hasn't been developed. It's not a safe space. And so, of course, and it was all optional. So, of course, teachers who did not invest the time in the beginning, we had to circle back around and address some of those concerns that had we built the thing that we could restore to, then we would have been on the right path. And so just, sometimes people have to try it out and see that it doesn't work. So getting in the practice of like prevention and investing your time in what you want and not what you don't want to see. And so one of the approaches that we used in Oakland was the 80%, 80, 15, 5. So we're going to spend 80% of our time in preventative. And that means like building relationships, having circles at the beginning of the day, maybe not every day, but at the beginning parts of the first 10 minutes. And teachers like, you can't do that. How do you do that? I'm like, I guarantee you middle schoolers, we can figure out how to do a quick check-in. And we actually did it in like sometimes 3 minutes with 30 kids, right? We can do it really quick. So that's one piece. You just do a lot of community building in the beginning. Then that 15%, people are human, harm is going to happen, conflicts will arise. But you only want to spend 15% of the time like addressing harm. And then 5%, so like if someone does have to leave the school community, how do we welcome them back in a way that supports their growth, that honors their dignity, and then allows them to feel welcome? What we do currently, I would say we probably spend 10% of our time prevention, and we spend 60% of our time in the harm and the conflict, and then the 30% in welcoming. If we just invested the time in the beginning, there would be a lot less harm for us to have to heal, and people would feel better. Like kids would walk into the classroom like, I want to be here, I want to learn, and it allows for creativity and inspiration. So those are a few things, and I can give more, but I want to make sure there's space.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. So I wanted to preface, so I didn't mention, I'm a restorative practices practitioner, restorative practices specialist doing school transformation work in Baltimore City. I'm also a circle keeper specifically within the juvenile justice system and communities. How do we use circles, right, for both community building and also as a response to harm, right? And so I'll preface that I'm currently working about 14 Baltimore City schools. And one of the things that I always say in my work is that I need to be specific and clear about what we're doing here. Nikki Giovanni says, if you're not asking the right questions, you're not going to get the answers that you want. And so the first part of that is acknowledging and admitting that most of what it is that we're doing across the board in school systems is simply restorative approaches, and it is not restorative practices. And the reason why I say that is because we have to stop telling the lie that restorative practices can coexist with the current structures and school systems that we have. It simply cannot. And so when I go into a school, what I admit and say is I am bringing restorative tools to make this space, right, safe for Black children, all children for Black children, but I know the limitations of what I'm doing here because restorative practices would require a complete transformation of this system, which means down to our testing, right, down to the hierarchies that we create in school buildings, down to our code of conduct that often criminalize children, down to our district offices, down to the positions within our district offices. Those are not restorative. And so what I never want to do is to lie to Black children and say that what I'm doing here is transformative when I know that that's not what's happening. I think about Joy James, Professor Joy James in Captive Maternal. This is an essay she wrote where she specifically talked about the ways in which things like restorative justice, transformative justice, restorative practices can be used by systems in order to stabilize that system. And this is what I mean. What school systems do is that they create, right, panelists of steering committees. And I mean, Lord Jesus Christ, if I see another steering committee, I don't know what I'm gonna do. And they take all of these budgets and all of this money and they say, we're doing a study group, we're doing a steering committee, we're going to hire all of these positions to tell us how to do this better. That's cute. But why do you need to do so when we already have the facts to tell us what are the conditions? And so what happens is that the school system takes this money and they bring in restorative practices specialists and they say, hey, y'all, look, we got the restorative practices specialists. We checked it off our list. Here they are. We hired them. Look, they're in the school system. Look what they're doing. And then all that does is stabilizes the state, because the state can now say, we brought restorative practices. We did it. Don't you see? When what we really know is that is not what is taking place within the school system. And so time and time again, what we do is that we're invested, and we have to tell the truth, in survival work. And so almost it is to say that the survival of all children, but specifically Black children, becomes wrapped up in the state. And so they take what we call restorative practices and they use it against our children. Because how many school systems can tell you that they have restorative practices, and when you look at the core of it, not a goddamn thing is happening? And so that's what I first want to kind of talk about. When we talk about abolition, it begins by checking off these unnecessary things that systems consistently do in order to deny us of the real change that is necessary. We don't need a steering committee to tell us that Black children and all children are being brutalized in schools by police, right? We don't need that. We know that. The facts can tell us that. And so what abolition does, right, is that it says, let's dead that, right? But also when we get bigger into abolition is that we have to analyze the current systems that we have. Restorative practices, once again, is a way of being. It is not a thing that you do, right? It is not a tool that you use in order to make children act right. Restorative practices is a matter of the heart, but it is also a matter of systems. And what we know is that the school systems we currently have are intrinsically linked to white supremacy, which means that they're quite literally an arm of white supremacy. How do we know that? We see in Baltimore where we have redlining, where children's schools are determined by their class. We have lead poisoning, where predominantly Black schools have high rates of lead poisoning in the water, to the point where Black children cannot even drink what's in the water fountain, right? We have teachers who do not have health insurance, teachers who are not getting paid, teachers who are being forced to go into classrooms during a pandemic. And so when we think about all of these structures and systems that exist, and we say, we're doing restorative practices, that is a lie. And so I think what we do when we say abolition is that abolition asks us to tell us ourselves the hard truths, which is in order for children to be safe in these systems, the very system itself as it exists can no longer do so. Because the history of education in this country is intrinsically linked to genocide, to colonialism, to slavery, right? And to the bondage of Black bodies. And so we have to tell that. We have to start from that base level, right? And so I think I always try to contextualize what I mean when I say abolition with that. And then I think lastly, what is our investment, right? Our investment is in the community and thinking about institutional betrayal. Oftentimes when I go into schools, the first thing I hear is, well, restorative practice is great, but these parents never come. We're never going to get the parents. And what people never do is they take the time to think about the generational betrayal that parents have had at the hands of school systems and while they're not present, right? And what does it mean to walk into a school building where parents are actually welcomed, where the work of the children's art is all over the school building, where the children are saying hello to the teachers and the teachers are saying hello to them, right? Where we're actually honoring knowledge and education in the way that we should. I think those are the very hard questions that we often are not admitting, and that we have to start from there a little bit. And I'm so excited, Dr. Chatman, to hear you come in with this other context of healing. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. The past 3 years, I've worked with young people throughout my career, maybe over the past 30 years or so, in different capacities, in special ed, in alternative schools, family literacy programs, and so forth. The past 3 years, though, however, I designed and piloted a program in partnership with the DC Department of Parks and Recreation called Youth Mind. And that's an acronym for Mindfulness Intervention for Nonviolent Development. And really the thinking behind that is that our young people grow up in a very violent world. White supremacy is violent, racism is violent, poverty is violent. All of those systems are violent. And so our children are exposed to that. And sometimes they're replicating some of this violent behavior because they are hurting, because their needs have not been met. And so Youth Mind, we ended up launching it as a virtual program because we did it last summer. This was part of a fellowship I had with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And so over about 5 weeks, we worked with 44 youth between the ages of 14 and 16. And the program basically has 4 components. We try to promote young people's resilience and thriving as best we can, honoring and understanding the limitations of the structure within which we're working through mindfulness and social emotional learning, right? And I share very similar critique around some of the mindfulness programming I see in schools. A lot of it is really just teaching our kids how to be okay with their oppression, right? Let's take a deep breath and then you're going to get suspended, right? If you come to school late tomorrow, right? So mindfulness and social emotional learning is one component of the program. Pro-social engagement between young people and college mentors or the other staff that we have. Restorative values, which we define as respect, resilience, reciprocity, you know, these 5 values that we've attached or see as the root of restorative practices and restorative justice. And then social justice awareness, right? Young people need to, and many of them already do, understand the structures and the systems that they're functioning within and sometimes struggling within, but striving within, right? So we worked with young people over a course of 5 weeks, and I was just really deeply touched and impressed by how our children really they want a restorative reality. They want a healthy reality. They want a thriving reality, right? They were very receptive to using mindfulness and centering practices and breathing and having a space where they can talk about the complexities of their lives and get some support to sort of navigate those complexities, the relationships with parents and with other peers. They were really receptive to learning how to communicate nonviolently, learning how to think about themselves nonviolently and to hold themselves with some compassion and with some value. Because so often in their communities or in their schools, they don't feel valued, they don't feel heard. We know that a lot of our young people are struggling in terms of their mental and emotional health, especially with COVID. They're socially isolated, they're dealing with a whole lot. So 4 months, we did our 4-month follow-up. I just got the report the other day, and a lot of the young people said, we're still using these practices, right? We used grant money to get, you know, yoga mats and some other tools that they could use at home. And of all the things we got for them, they said, we're using these stress balls when we're on class because we are about tired of Zoom and we can't see people. And, you know, it's how, as we dismantle these systems, as we speak these truths, as we do all of this, how do we restore our babies? How do we send them the message that you are loved and you are valued? And these are some of the things you can do while you're in this struggle to take care of yourselves. The young people told us they shared some of these practices with their parents or somebody else in their household. You know, we know that white supremacy culture prioritizes competition and all sorts of toxicity, detaching us from ourselves, from our innate beauty and resilience. So I think it's important that we center that as well in a number of ways, right? We also did, we had a spoken word artist work with us over the summer, and young people appreciated the opportunity to use their voice and to use the arts to express how they're feeling and what they were facing. So this is just, you know, one small intervention, but for me, it demonstrates the need to tend to the healing, the wholeness of our children and youth.
Thank you all. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to open it up for commissioners to ask any questions. I'm actually going to ask 2 more questions. So one question is, just to give you all the opportunity, if you haven't named anything, or if you would like to name other things, when you think about recommendations this committee could lift up for the full commission, that both address the policing of young people in schools as well as in the larger community, what are some of those recommendations that you think are key? In whatever way you want to look at that. Some of the recommendations that are moving forward are looking at specific legislations that need to be changed. Some are looking at some of those practices and culture shifts that need to take place. Others are looking at the budget and where do we need to divest from, where do we need to invest in? And so that really is as open as it sounds when you think about the ways in which young people, in particular, Black young people, are policed in schools and in our communities. What are some ways, what are some recommendations you think we can lift up or would like to see us lift up? Whoever would like to go first.
I'll just say briefly, a lot more investment in community organizations and community resources. I remember when we had youth court in our schools. I don't know if I would return it with that name, but some sort of youth entity where young people are supporting each other and working out some of these, the challenges they face. Some of this stuff is, we asked young people, what's the source of a lot of conflict that you all see? Because we didn't focus so much on policing, but we focused on, what are the eruptions that you experience? They said it was hood beef, jealousy, and just regular old teenage stuff that escalates online and gets out into the community, right? So what might it look like if we really invest young people, invest in them as leaders to help support other youth in managing some of these conflicts and difficulties? We also talked with young people and taught them more about adolescent brain development and how their bodies are changing. And this was something else that they said, we don't get a lot of information about. We want to know about this. We want to know how our brain is changing, our body is changing. We didn't know it's hormonal and all this other stuff. You mean I can do things to sort of manage my mood, right? So just a lot more investment in the things that young people need that will help them grow and thrive, I think is really important, whether that's, the return of a youth entity to help them manage some of these conflicts and support their behaviors. There was another one, but I'm slightly older than some of you and it's escaping me right now. It's going to be real transparent, but I'll come back to it. If it returns, I'll come back.
Me and Ashlee. I'm gonna let you take this, Ashlee. Know you out there.
So the work we do at Impact Justice with the Restorative Justice Project, we do restorative justice diversion. Bilphena, I love what you said. At some point, this is not an alternative, it's not diversion, but this is the way that we approach the work. And so one of our goals is to see that community doesn't call the police, and community has the resources. It already does have the resources, but there's people in the community who can do the supporting when a harm has occurred. And so thinking about within a school, I know you're all focused on the police, but I'm gonna focus on what the school can do and how it can build out that infrastructure. And so and it's gonna take time. And so I don't know how much time this y'all have in working with the school districts, but really to have an integrated school with restorative justice at a minimum, it's 5 years minimum. The first year, you're just getting people aware of what is restorative justice and familiar with restorative justice, because it's a different approach to being with one another, to engaging, to interacting. You're having honest conversations. As we talked about white supremacy, part of white supremacy is not being direct, right? And so that's part one. Year 2 and 3, people are like, okay, I got it, I'm familiar with it, and they're now requesting to have more restorative options, either that's to build community or to address harm. And then in year 3 or 4, this is with having someone who is taking ownership and supporting restorative justice at the school site. But then you see around year 3 or 4, like you actually almost don't need a person anymore because the community is so familiar with restorative justice. Teachers, young people are, not even teachers are running circles, but young people are running the circles. So at the school site we had peacemakers. And there was one time where we had a harm circle. It was a school, they split the school in half. Of course, like like you have one school against the other school. One school got more resources, and so there were groups of sisters on both sides of the school that fought. So then like the whole school kind of got involved. And in this situation, the families weren't, neither of the families spoke English. And so one of my peacemakers who'd been with me for about 2 or 3 years was very familiar with restorative justice, with addressing harm. We had conversations, we did all the prep work, but myself and another adult, we were silent the whole time. And the young people in their own language were able to hold space and keep circle. And so I say that to say that part of this, when you're making it part of the culture where you don't need police, is because you've built in, you've invested, you've nurtured, you've grown everything that folks need just to be themselves, to be able to help one another. So you don't need the police. We didn't need the police when the schools fought each other because we had people in the community who knew one another. And that's also another important thing, having people from the community being with the community, but who knew one another, and then also had the tools, and we had the practice, and families were familiar. This wasn't their first time hearing about restorative justice. They were familiar with restorative justice. And so they're like, yes, we want to participate in it. So building that credibility, I come back to like data. It's really important to just like making sure that you're tracking what's happening, what's working, what's not working, so that your program can be a program. I hate to say programs, restorative justice is more than a program, but in this situation, so it can be sustained. And there was something else I was going to say, but yeah, it takes a minimum 5 years. Everybody needs to be involved: families, young people, admin, everybody, like staff, custodians, folks in the front office. Everybody needs to be aware of this, and there has to be a shift in from punitive to restorative. I know I keep saying this, but it's really important that the infrastructure sets the tone, and not just the policies and the programs. It has to be built and then come from within and be part of the culture.
Thank you, Ashlee. I see someone had the hands up.
Yeah, so that was helpful. I guess I was going to ask, and I would kind of like defer to the co-chairs about this, but for me at least, I think it would be helpful to kind of get that 5-year plan in writing. And this is what I'm going to defer to the co-chairs because I'm not sure if they sort of like have that already. The reason is, as someone who definitely supports abolishing police in schools, I think one of the concerns that we always hear from elected officials is like, that's not something that I can sort of just like put in a bill tomorrow. And kind of like to your point, it is a longer term process. And I feel like if we were able to get them to see like, here's the thing you can put in the bill tomorrow and to do tomorrow, but here are the things you need to do next year and the year after that and the year after that and the year after that, I think it'd be easier to get there.
So I guess I'll answer the first question that the man that answered, and then give us the opportunity to come to that comment, that question, which I think is important. So, right, it's two things here. As an organizer, I come to this work as an organizer first, right? Restorative practices is not something that I started as a career. It is something that I one, being that I'm from Liberia, it is something that I lived first and understood what it looks like to have cultures that are restorative, because we know that most of restorative practices, transformative justice, its roots and its home is within Indigenous, Native American, First Nations folks, and African cultures. I think what I always struggle with this conversation is once again, like the amount of the slowness that we talk about, right? Getting one, school police is very new. First of all, policing is new. It's, fairly new. We did not always exist with police. Schools did not always exist with police. If you look at the timeline, actually within the 1800s, 1850s, when Boston, actually people think that it started in New York, but Boston had the first ever police force. And the purpose of that police force, they wasn't doing nothing. They was getting drunk at night, right? They wasn't solving no case. They was just there. And then what we know is that when emancipation and the abolishment of slavery happened, that is when we saw police unionize and become the institution that we now know. So the policing structure became a way of taking Black folks who had been freed from slavery and placing them back into slavery through the process of imprisonment, right? And so school police itself, well, even when we look specifically at Baltimore City, when we look at Baltimore City's police, actually the reason why Baltimore police exist was because after Maryland had the highest population of free Black folks for a very long time in the 1800s. And so what they did was they decided they would deport Black people back to Africa, which is where the Maryland Colonization Society and the Maryland colonization came from. And so the very existence of Baltimore police, specifically within Maryland, was the purpose of deporting free Black people from their home and back to Africa, right? So I want to preface it with that. But the reason I say that is because when we have these conversations about, what folks are willing to write in the bill and what takes time, it's hard for me because it's not a matter of what is possible. What we know is that it was possible to quickly make policing a thing, and therefore it is possible to quickly remove policing. And so I struggle because the conversation we're having is how do we kind of navigate and how do we negotiate with white supremacy? And I don't know how to do so. I'm not in negotiation with white supremacy. And so what we consistently do is we tell our children, oh, just wait, one more thing. We're just give us one more year. Okay. And then what we see is 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and we're still sitting in the very same place we're sitting with another committee, another conversation, another event to answer the very same questions that we have been answering since the very existence of policing. And so I struggle with that because it's like, well, what do we do? What we do is we quite literally take police officers out of schools. I tell my teachers that I coach all the time, you cannot teach children you don't love, because if you don't love a child, you don't value them. If you don't value a child, your imagination to be able to teach them is stunted, right? So if you cannot teach children that you don't love, what do we tell our children who are walking in schools where we're quite literally saying that you do not have the ability to have autonomy and agency over your bodies? And so what we're going to do instead is place officers in the building who have the ability to arrest you, who oftentimes have guns, who have keys, and the keys are jingling as they're going through the school building, who are in their uniforms, who have their radio on, and it's very clear what their presence is in that school building. How can we say that schools are sites of safety and learning and valuing of children when we could literally take an entity that was created to enslave and put violence against Black people into those school buildings? I'm confused. I'm quite like, that's what I tell people all the time. I'm confused by what we're talking about. Are we actually prioritizing children? My recommendation is that we love children. My recommendation is that we value children. My recommendation is that we value community and safety, because if we did, we will move a little bit faster. But what happens is that our children have to wait, where they're going through systems that completely impacts their entire lives. One, we look at Black children, specifically Black girls in Baltimore City, where they make up 30% of the population, yet they make up 65% of the population in the juvenile justice system. Black girls are detained longer times than any other people. And then when we look at the data for disabled Black children, the number just sky highs, where we have Black children with disabilities who are currently sitting in jails and prisons because of the presence of school police in their buildings. And then we look at the literally sex trafficking and how school to prison pipeline impacts and quite literally lead our children into that path. And so when we talk about healing and we talk about how to ensure that our children are safe in all manner, where they have agency and autonomy, that is not possible with policing in their schools. It's simply not, and we have to tell the truth. And so we're having a conversation about how to make white supremacy palatable, well, I don't know. My answer to that is I don't know. But if we're having a conversation about how do we create structures and systems that value children, then what I can tell you is we can begin, right? Not only by taking police out of the school systems, making sure every school have windows, that there are plants in the building, that there's clean drinking water for children, that children see themselves within the curriculum, that children have access, right, to therapy, to social workers. Currently, we have Baltimore City schools that don't even have counselors in the building. You have over how many children and one counselor who don't even come to the school, right? And so what we're creating is schools as sites, right, of creating the very same systems that we see in real life. Schools are not neutral to what happens within society. Our school buildings are a microcosm of our bigger society. And so that is, simply put, y'all, I'm tired of sitting in circles. In addition to my work as a restorative practices practitioner, I teach political education to a group of Black children here in Baltimore City in a program called New Generation Scholars. My youngest is 13, my oldest is 21. 2 years ago, we got a chance to go to Ghana. Every year we choose a new country because part of the process is teaching our children, as Dr. Chatman said, how to have value in themselves, how to see themselves as whole people, and how to essentially take that white gaze off their shoulder, right? That you do not allow other people to tell you who you are, right? But what I'm tired of, y'all, and we have to stop gaslighting children, because that is what we're doing, is sitting in circles with children consistently, and they're giving us the answers and telling us what we need to do to create healthy communities. And we're continuously saying, oh, baby, that's not gonna work. That, let me tell you, they're not gonna invest in that. Babe, nah, let's just tune it down just a tad bit. I don't know what to do no more, because our children are doing what they need to do. The adults aren't. And so, like, that's where I'm at, y'all. I got to keep it 100 because my priority are children. Nothing else is my priority but children. They are centered in everything that I do. And so the conversations oftentimes, they're not about the children, and we have to be honest. And so if we're not having a conversation about the children, I don't know what we're talking about. And how are the children? That is the question we should be asking each of us. They're unwell. So how do we make them well? Not drag our feet and keep lying to them and gaslighting them. That's my recommendation.
Thank you for that. And to each of you all, Sultan, we'll come back and circle around what you lifted up. I want to, Bilphena, and I'm laughing because you're just like guiding the conversation in a way that I think is extremely productive. And so I'm gonna ask two questions but you kind of already answered them, but I'm gonna ask them anyway. So one was, what question do you want us to ask that we haven't asked? So you just named one of those questions, right? Like, what about the children? And what do we need to do there? But open that up to everyone. What is the question that we need to ask that we're not asking? And then the other, so there is a shorter history of restorative justice here in DC and within our schools. And so we're probably at that 5-year timeline. And what I hear often is its critique around restorative justice, even within DC, that it's been co-opted and it has been used as a way just to maintain the status quo, or as someone else named it, right? How do we teach oppressed young people to be okay with oppression, or to navigate through oppression? And so that has been a critique of the way that restorative justice has been happening in DC. And so my other question, so there was, what question do we need to ask that we're not asking? And then the other was like, when we're thinking about, as this conversation has been framed around alternatives, like, what should we not do? What should we not be replicating? What has gone wrong when you think about all these practices that people have lifted up as best practices, people have like pinpointed to as like, y'all should do this, but like, what is the real, like, this is what goes wrong, please do not do this, please do not perpetuate this, because it might have the label of restorative justice, but in reality is causing more harm than good. Those two things, whoever wants to take it, however you want to take it.
I mean, one question around the policing is, do police make schools safer? You know, so no. And I mean, yeah. And so that's one question. And then obstacles or things to watch out for. It's been named plenty of times. Co-optation, white supremacy. It will find its way, and it will start off looking like we are doing the right thing, that folks are in circle, people feel like they belong, and then slowly the insidious tentacles and the poison will work its way in. So being very vigilant, one of the words that I have about, like, what are the philosophy, what are the principles, and then not drawing the line, but being firm. So oftentimes within our model, like, folks, like, how can I say it? You have to have a strong restorative core, because punitiveness will ask you to draw back to it. And so that's something to watch out for. I have seen, and I mentioned this earlier, around being very clear around the addressing race and talking about race. Just because you do restorative justice, you can use it, and you can have a circle that's racist, and I've been in circles where people have said and done racist things. And so you can, not only with racism, but you can do harm to people. And so just being very clear about that. And then accountability. I would ask, what's your accountability process? Who are y'all accountable to? How do they continue to hold you accountable to their needs? And then with the follow-up, what's the continuous accountability process that community that you are offering community to hold you all to account, and to the folks who are going to be, I don't know what exactly all the details, but the execution of it, like who's going to be following up and making sure that folks are good.
And I think, Ashlee, you brought up a good point that I also wanted to bring, right? Which is, y'all, I go to events all the time and things like these conversations where constantly community members and educators are having to prove why restorative practices, why we should move this change. And what I'm telling y'all is, I've never been to events where police officers had to sit on the panel and prove why they should be in schools. No one has ever sat down and tell us why, right? Why has policing never had to prove itself? If we say that we're going by logistics and we're going by numbers and we're going by stats, well, let's look at the number, y'all. If policing was a business, it would be considered a bad business because it is not bringing what it said it would. According to the existence and purpose of policing in schools, is that it's supposed to make schools more safer. It's supposed to bring down quote unquote crime, right? It's supposed to make the school community better for the children. And yet time and time again, the stats says otherwise. These are stats made by scientists, researchers, right? And we're continuously ignoring the very stats that has said and proven that policing has never had a positive impact on any community. And so the question becomes, when are we going to put police officers on the stand and ask them why they should exist in schools? When are we going to pull up the stats and say, according to your stats and your business plan, your business is terrible because it is not bringing the numbers it said it would. So therefore, if this was a legitimate business, we would say it should be ended. Because if y'all look at school system consistently, we're like, well, we should remove the budget. We should remove the budget. Why are we continuously funding something that doesn't work? It's bad science. Forget morality, right? Because this is also an issue of morality. Point blank period, policing is immoral, right? But forget morality. Let's just go down to the numbers. It's not adding up. Policing has never added up. And so my question becomes, are we ever going to have that opportunity to ask those questions and to have policing prove itself? Because our children are constantly having to prove themselves. Our community members are constantly having to prove themselves. Here we are on a panel telling you all why right? We should have this way of life. Here we are on the panel telling y'all why policing shouldn't exist. Why are we proving ourselves? If you look at the numbers, restorative practices work. If you look at communities where policing doesn't exist, they're thriving. So clearly the research, the science is there. And then I think that is really, really where I'm at. And I love, Ashlee, that you brought in the piece of accountability, right? Because we have to be led by communities. And so who holds us accountable? Where are the children at, right? Where are the children who are able to enter into these conversations and says, simply put, this is terrible? Where are the children who get to share their experiences and say, nah, this has never worked? But oftentimes what happens is our children come and they're still not listened to, right? And there is no accountability. And that communities are taught to put their faith in all of these alternatives and these conversations. And time again, community members don't see nothing out of it. It is the same thing over and over and over again. And so that is my biggest question. When will policing prove itself? Because it hasn't for as long as it has existed.
Thank you. I dropped in, I'm starting a stack. I saw, and Sultan, I'm not circling back because I see you're in the chat right now and want to just see if you feel like your question was addressed.
I mean, I think it was like what I would just say is like, I appreciate the like why police don't need to be in schools. Like, I'm just going to speak for myself, not the full committee. Like, again, like I'm there with why they don't need to be. Like, that's why I was sort of like asking the question sort of Ashlee, I hope I'm pronouncing the name right, of, so like, what is the next step that we can recommend specifically to the council to get there? And if it is, if, you know, we're saying it's a 5-year plan, like what is that 5-year plan? If like we want to move to like, it's tomorrow, like what is the next step? And again, like, I don't think we need to do it now. And this is why I was deferring to the chairs. Like, I don't know if like we have the time to do it now, but what I think would be helpful for me at least is like, what is the like, this can be written into legislation to get there. Because like, I agree that like, I know I'm tired of like having these conversations. And so for me, again, it is like, not necessarily like, why do we need to do it? I'm there. Like, what is it? And again, also back to like what Blaine and I were sort of talking about, like, I don't trust the council to like put children first. Like, I think it's got to be much more specific of this is what it needs to look like. And there are a lot of great experts around the screen today. And so if there are, like, if there's time to sort of discuss the, like, what would it look like to implement this in DC, specifically like in legislation like that, I would find really, really beneficial in addition to the conversation that we've had today.
I just want to clarify, the 5-year plan was not 5 years to get police out. It was just like how you build a community that's like, that the culture, like restorative justice is part of the culture. Like, okay. I think out on day one, but that year is just like usually what it takes to like shift culture and have transformation in culture. That's what I meant. My
okay.
apologies.
No, and that's helpful too, because like what we've heard even from Councilmember Allen is the big question that he gets from other council members is like, you take police out of school and then what? Like, what do you replace it with? And like, I love the idea of replacing it with a culture that you don't need them for. And so I think like that might also be helpful is like, you tell them, look, take police out tomorrow and like, we're gonna do a 5-year plan to like change the culture. Again, I'm not saying I'm the expert on this. And that's why like, I appreciate the conversation and like any of the specifics around like what we can tell council to specifically do after police leave, I think would be beneficial.
I mean, I'm sorry, Sultan, I was gonna say is something important to note though, right, is the culture shift is because of policing. Like, I think that's what I'm trying to get at, right? So if we say, well, we take policing out of the schools tomorrow, so what, then what? We take them out, then what? Nothing. We keep what we have, because what happens is when we take the police out of the schools, so many of the very issues that exist in the schools that we call bad behavior, they leave with them. So even how we consider when we take out the carceral system, taking police out of schools means redefining what we consider crime, right? And redefining how we look at what we call code of conduct. Taking policing out of schools means redefining what we consider as punishment, right? And so the very absence of police in schools already puts us back on track to a restorative culture. But it is because of the presence of policing in schools that take us away from that culture. And so taking them out in itself is a solution and a strategy because it removes the culture that they bring into the school building. So I just wanted to make that note.
Can I raise a question?
Go ahead, Ron.
Can I raise a question?
Commissioner Hampton, sorry.
Oh no, you can call me anything. I don't care. But the thing, first of all, let me acknowledge Dr. Chatman. How you doing, Dr. Chatman? So good to see you. My sister, let me ask you this. Doesn't the same white supremacist system that exists as it relates to policing in this country exist in the educational system?
Yep, white supremacy is at the core of every system that exists within this country.
That's exactly the point that I'm making. So, why do you think the police wasn't sitting in the and I'm not being an apologist, nor am I protecting them, but they wasn't sitting in the room when the policy that was developed in the schoolhouse about how to handle children and what was criminal and what wasn't. The police wasn't sitting in that room. White supremacy was sitting in that room, not the police. And the police had their own cross to bear. But the school system is based on a white supremacist system that has victimized and continue to victimize our children. And the police didn't have anything to do with that. They may have played a supportive role in reference to when the principals say that an administrative issue now is a criminal issue. So I want the police to come in here and do something about it. Then they were brought in to deal something about it. But the same system that you're talking about that exists in policing exists in our school system. So if we're going to root out, if we're going to take the position that we're going to root out the police, which I'm totally in agreement of, get rid of them, don't have them in the school. And the reason that I say that is because I used to be one myself from 1970 to 1994, and I know their performance does not justify them being in there. But let me correct you on this. In a white racist system that established policing, they don't have to prove their worth. They prove their worth by locking up Black folk because that's what a white racist system does. And that's what they've been doing, locking up Black folk. Mass incarceration is about the incarceration of Black folk, unjust incarceration of Black folk. And what we've seen is a disparity in that process. So they can justify their existence because their existence is based on the wrongful incarceration and the jailing of Black people and the mistreatment of Black people. They prove that every day, that they exist. But if you do that, then don't you have to do something about the white supremacist foundational system of education in this country? You got to. You just can't leave it alone because what you said is absolutely true. But that don't mean because you move the police out that the system is going to. I work in schools now, and it's not. I haven't seen a police in a classroom since I've been up there. But there's still the oppression and suppression of education of our Black students is going on by the teachers and the people who work for DCPS. So what you gonna do about that? Because see, we wasn't tasked with a mandate of bringing back recommendations for changing DCPS. We were tasked with bringing back recommendations to change the Metropolitan Police Department, but the cause of the intersectionality of this issue, then we can offer something, but that's not going to change the white racist supremacist system that DCPS operates. But you got to talk about both. You can't talk about one without talking about the other. Do you agree, disagree?
So I do hear what you're saying, and you are right, that policing is not the only thing. I think though, one of the mistakes we made is separating policing and white supremacy. And so yes, I'm talking specifically about the policing in schools, but when we talk about our carceral system, which is where policing comes from, we understand that carceral systems are white supremacy. And so the reason why I place an emphasis in being able to remove them is because there are systems and structures within school system that do rely on the carceral system, even with the absence of the police, like you said. And so when we look at suspensions, we look at detentions, that is a carceral system, right? And so what we know is that when we police officers and police from schools, what we do is that we destabilize the carceral system that allows for those things to happen, right? And why I'm emphasizing that is because when we think about the school to prison pipeline, let's think about it on the larger level. We look at how so many Black children are funneled, right, into those systems and into white supremacy systems. They come directly out of that. And so what I'm saying is, in order for us to completely change the school system, white supremacy would have to not exist, right? Clearly, none of us on this panel can change that today. But what I'm saying is that policing is the strong arm of white supremacy that exists.
Oh, I totally agree with you, but then education is the education arm of white supremacy too. Because yeah. Oh no.
Yeah. So the panel is specifically talking about policing in schools and how they exist, right? And so that is what I'm saying. That is a carceral system that is intertwined, and that police officers are overseers of white supremacy. And the reason why they take place in buildings is because they're able to do the everyday work of white supremacy. White supremacy needs soldiers. They need people who can do the everyday work. They need people who can impact the everyday lived experiences of our children. That is what police officers do. They are the bodies of white supremacy.
No, I totally agree with you, but I could make the argument that teachers are the same thing.
May I?
So just for time, and Commissioner Bob, before you go, we were starting a stack and Naike was up next, if that's okay.
Great.
Thank you, Samantha. And thank you so much to our panelists. I know I'm not alone in being so grateful for your expertise and your willingness to be completely honest with us. I, in my day job, I work with children in what a former colleague of mine taught me not to say the child welfare system, but the family regulation system. And so this particular committee is tasked actually with looking at policing youth generally and not just in schools. So while I'm 100% there with you all on removing police from the schools completely, like I'm also thinking about how, like you said, schools are just a microcosm of what's happening on the outside anyway. So my clients, our students, they're bringing in all of this trauma with them. They're bringing in that experience of the carceral system that they're experiencing out in their communities and their homes into the schools anyway. And I'm just wondering, like, because we're thinking of alternatives to policing for our young people everywhere, right, outside of schools as well, if you could speak to, any of you could speak to like recommendations regarding education or public campaigns, like how you really integrate the community and educate people around alternatives even outside of schools. Because one thing that I've seen in the juvenile system here in DC is that parents just feel really overwhelmed and have internalized this idea that you use the court system, you use the police, like those are the tools that you have to help with your child's behavior if you can't manage it yourself, or whatever, if your child is having a mental health concern or anything like that, you turn to that system because that's what's been internalized, right? Because we know that white supremacy is insidious. So if you had any recommendations around sort of the outside of school piece, I'd love an opportunity to hear from you all on that.
I can just think of community health workers and, perhaps even training youth or other people in the community to serve this kind of community stabilization, community restorative role. The police, law enforcement, they can't serve that role anyway. People end up dead when folks are having mental breakdowns and needing real help. So we need to create another structure, another entity that really can step into that role. Community health workers have been doing this kind of work. Trained mental health experts in communities. It really doesn't take a whole lot, I don't think. Regular people can be certified in mental health first aid. Why can't those folks get paid to serve a small segment of the community? Why can't it be incentivized that communities have healing circles and sort of treat each other or help each other? Of course, not very severe traumatic cases that requires a different level of expertise and training, but I think you're right. We, so many of us have gotten used to, this is what this entity is for. This is what police are for. And as we've heard, they don't perform in that area, not to our benefit. So let's employ some other models.
Thank you. And all of those sound great. I'm just wondering if any of you have done the work, like the organizing work, like you've said, of like bringing in, people who have relied on police in the past, and just how you do that.
Yeah, so currently I've been holding restorative practices workshop for specifically parents, and it's called Cultivating a Restorative Household. And what I have been doing, I've realized, is that there has to be a holistic approach where while our children are getting the restorative practices within the schools, we then have to do a reconditioning of our parents at the same time. And we have to give them the tools in order for them to be able to, one, restoratively approach their children, so that what the children are seeing in schools are reflection in the home, are reflection in the communities, right? And so first, that was the first part. And having our parents unlearn this thing of domination, because most of what you're describing comes from the need of control, compliance, and domination. That is kind of how we have learned to engage with children, with youth, right, is to control them. And so I first begin by doing that work with our parents, that very important work, especially our elders, right, and reconditioning how they have seen parenting and relationship and community building. So we first start there. And then I think about organizations like Safe Streets in Baltimore. There is the Violence Interrupters in Chicago as well, where they quite literally have community members, specifically returning citizens, or folks who have been incarcerated, who are out in the streets, who know the neighborhood, who know the kids, who know the streets to the back of their hands, and they're out on different corners in them streets. And as soon as they see them little babies ready to act up, they snatch them back. And what's beautiful about it is that a lot of the violence interrupters, they have that street cred that the kids gonna listen to them, because a lot of them did time already. And so the kids are like, all right, if you say it, I'm not gonna do that. So we have that. We also have something like Baltimore Ceasefire currently, where we have been working specifically on how we bring the honor back to life, something that Dr. Chatman has been talking about. Erica Bridgeford in Baltimore City does this thing where every time that a youth or person is killed, she goes to the area and she has a ceremony. And the whole idea is to bring back the value of life for our children and for our communities. And so all of the kids are able to see once again that you are valuable and that we see you. But I think lastly, it really goes back, right, to us honoring the knowledge production that is already happening. If you look into a lot of communities, you got probably Mr. Joe who's been living there for 35 years, who can tell you about every child on that corner, what time they come outside to play on their scooter, who their mama was, what their mama did, and what does it look like for us to see them as knowledge producers and tap on them instead. When I grew up in Liberia, I always used to make the joke that when I got in trouble in school, my mama ain't know, because by the time I got home, all the elders along the way snatched my little behind up. And so they've been like, how'd you do in school? What did you do? How was it? And so creating these community structures, and this is why restorative practices and circling up our communities, I'm always challenging people. I say, how often do you circle up, right? With your friends, with your spouse, with the people down the street, getting to know them, having neighborhood events, and building those relationships is really where it comes out of. But I think it's just us not reinventing the wheel and going back to those organizations that are already doing it, those communities that already have the structures, but they're not listened to, right? You have the paraeducators in schools, the lunch ladies in schools. You got those people who know more about them kids than anybody do. We have to begin to say that a degree and the education, the traditional education, is not what determines a person's ability to exist and work with our children. And how do we place that value back on community? And making sure, I tell my kids, I said, if everybody do a little bit, nobody got to do a lot. So within the youth that I work with, what I create is we have an accountability team, we have a care team. And so how it works is I'm already structuring my children to understand the importance of how we create accountability structures, because they understand that accountability is an internal thing. Can't nobody but yourself hold yourself accountable. But then also, what does it mean to have community care for each other? And so as little as my babies are, my 13-year-old, somebody got a headache, Did y'all create a care package? Did y'all call them? Somebody came to virtual class and you noticed their camera is not on. Could you write them a letter? Could you check in? Somebody got a headache. All right, we got some lavender oil. Let's bring it out. And so we create quite literally these care, and this is the importance of healing justice, right? And I love healing justice because it does begin to answer these questions of the structures we create, right? To bring in that healing piece and that care piece so that we do have communities that have the autonomy and agency to run themselves, because we had them before. They have existed before.
Thank you. So put it in the chat, but we have Commissioner Bob and then Commissioner Bell. I'm also noticing that we are pushing time. If there's a specific person you want to address your question to, if you can name that, that would be helpful.
I'll keep my comments until we have the panel of educators. And the only comment that I would make is that if we were to survey our community, including, our district leaders, parents, probably educators, I'm not sure that many would be able to define what restorative justice is in the context of what we are, in a context of this discussion and how it would improve, could be implemented within our school district. And I want to thank the panel, having been responsible for a major larger school district that I ran. I want to thank the panel for tonight's discussion, because many of the comments that were made would have made me a better person in managing that school district, were some of the thoughts that were outlined tonight on the table at that time. But I would just close by saying, I'm not sure that our community really knows what restorative justice is or how it would be implemented in our school district.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. Alina Bell, I'm current principal at DC Public Schools, so I think the conversation is timely. And I just wanted to make one statement in agreement with Bilphena, in that right now, I think the district is approaching, and they use the word revisioning school security in schools. And so she made a point around, what that revisioning looks like and how much of those structures will continue or show up in different ways. And so I do want to just name for the group that the conversation is happening, but to Mr. Hampton's point, it is multifaceted and multi-layered because of the folks in classrooms and leading and guiding schools are also working under the same premises that have, we've grown up with a lot of the systemic racism and oppression. And so I think that's part of the tough part that DCPS specifically, many major districts are grappling with. But what I can say is that the district is thinking about its conversations with students and hearing student feedback. They've conducted a number of work sessions with middle school and high school students. Right now, they're also in the plans for conducting these work sessions or work groups or thought groups with principals. And I'll speak to principals specifically because I think sometimes we might make assumptions that principals or folks in the building want or rely heavily on the police to support us with students. But one thing I think that the commission and the work that we can do, because in conversations with principals, it was around supporting outside community or folks, adults who come into the building to be disruptive and not necessarily the support for students. And so how can some of the recommendations that we put forth combined with other committees or commission work with other committees support how we engage with adults, parents, community members who come in. These are just things that principals named. They didn't name the support that we needed with students, but it was really around the support that we might need with some of the adults. So just wanting to name that blind spot and not making assumptions that, principals or teachers want police in schools to support with students, but we are thinking about other supports and the safety of the school in general, and how can we achieve that without school security or without our security officers.
Thank you. We are exactly at 8 p.m. I want to thank all of our commissioners for your questions, for leaning into curiosity, and hopefully for feeling and being agitated and being willing to be agitated in this process, and for growth. Thank you to all of our panelists today for bringing your full selves to this space unapologetically. Absolutely appreciate and value that so much. Want to name that Impact Justice did send an email out with some resources for commissioners to read. Panelists, if there are other things, whether it's things that we can study, things that we can watch, what have you, that can support us, if you can email that, that would be greatly appreciated, and we can pass that on to the commissioners as well. I might not have dropped it to all panelists, but Dr. Chatman did do a TED Talk that I found very useful for my work. And so we'll share that as well. But if there's any resources that you can continue to share with us, please go ahead and do that. With that, I will pass it to Impact Justice to close us out.
Thank you all so much. This was so incredible. And I wish we had like another 5 hours with all of you, but unfortunately we don't. But yeah, if there are any resources, clips, videos, whatever, please email them to me. And then last reminder that next Wednesday, we're having our educators panel. And I think you all may have gotten a calendar invite for ad hoc recommendations committee meeting for Tuesday night. We're actually no longer going to be having that. So you're free Tuesday, and we're just meeting Wednesday for the educator panel. All right. But again, thank you, Bilphena, Ashlee, Dr. Chatman. Thank you all so much. Y'all are incredible.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
It was great.
Everyone, be well.
Good night, everyone. Be well.
Take care.